I'm presenting on leprosy, stigma, and interpersonal violence. Specifically, I'm curious as to whether individuals with leprosy are more predisposed to being victimized via interpersonal violence. In order to support my thesis, I have drawn on sources from art history in order to provide a more comprehensive analysis of artistic renderings of the disease or similarly manifested diseases in the past, as well as a plethora of sources providing information on the etiology of the bacterium behind the disease, transmission, immune response, manifestation, skeletal changes, and prevalence. Many peer-reviewed research articles have also been utilized in order to help supplement my elementary research. The bacterium responsible is known as Mycobacterium leprae, and it is related to the mycobacterium that causes tuberculosis. Individuals with an adequate immune response can protect themselves against the bacterium. This accounts for approximately 95% of the population. Therefore, the disease develops in individuals with an inadequate immune response. Leprosy can occur in other species such as chimpanzees, megabe monkeys, and armadillos, and infection is more likely to be fatal in non-human species. The mycobacterium is transmitted via moisture droplets expelled when an infected person sneezes or coughs. Such a person can expel up to 20 million bacilli with a single blow of their nose. Droplets discarded on the ground have also been known to survive in favorable conditions. The disease will spread through the bloodstream of an infected person, and because the bacterium prefers cooler environments, it travels to the host's skin, particularly the arms, legs, and face. Variability in manifestation of the disease is due to individuals' varying immune system statuses. After initial transmission, the incubation period can range from 2 to 5 years. The two major forms of the disease are the tuberculoid form and the lepromatous form. However, there are also intermediate or borderline types of the disease. The tuberculoid form is less infective and not as widely distributed throughout the body, whereas the lepromatous form is more infectious, with greater distribution and characterized by lesions and ravaging soft tissue damage. The latter form is more commonly addressed in paleopathological literature, since it invokes more obvious physical damage. Skin lesions occur in both forms. Loss of sensation can also occur and peripheral nerve damage. Sensation loss predisposes the affected region to injury and infection. Skeletal changes occur in only 5% of individuals, and these changes primarily take place in the extremities. Common skeletal changes include resorption of the nasal spine, pitting or eventual perforation of the hard palate, resorption of the alveolar bone, tooth loss, penciling of the digits on the hands and feet, as well as limb loss. The craniofacial changes have been referred to as facies leprosa. The last endemic case of the disease in Europe was reported in 1950. In the 19th century, the disease surfaced in Australia, but more recently, the greatest number of cases have been in India, the Philippines, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Burma, tropical Africa, and Pacific Islands, with approximately 60% of the world's cases residing in India. In the Americas, Brazil has the greatest amount of cases, although isolated cases have occurred in California, Hawaii, Louisiana, Texas, and Puerto Rico. Throughout the medieval period, leprosy was endemic in Europe, and this disease, along with others, were represented in the artistic renderings of the period. Diseases such as syphilis, bubonic plague, typhus, and leprosy were sometimes confused and conflated in paintings at this time. The imagery of the diseased, vagrant, and those of lower socioeconomic status coalesced, particularly in 16th century Venetian art. Depictions of the diseased in Venetian art are often characterized by iconography involving Saint Roch and Saint Lazarus. Saint Lazarus represented a biblical rendering of a leprous beggar, and according to legend, Saint Roch aided the sick and isolated himself from the rest of society after he contracted leprosy. Images of the two saints were also conflated in art. Saint Roch can be recognized as a man in pilgrim's attire of a hat and cloak, commonly drawing up his pants to expose a mark of infection on his thigh. Some researchers believe that these displays drew parallels to the biblical suffering of Christ, so to speak, in which it was implied that the pain they dealt with in their lives would ultimately purify them for the next life. However, it's very likely that these depictions raise suspicions regarding immigrants and travelers, as it enforced the idea that signatures of disease could be concealed. By 1506, the Venetian government made it illegal for marginalized groups such as the diseased and vagrant to cover their faces in any manner, particularly as a means to make it harder to conceal infection. The first leprosy hospital was established under Constantine in the 4th century Rome. This was followed by establishment of another in Caesarea in 372 AD by Saint Basil, in accordance with some sources. The first lazaretto, a sort of quarantine station, was built in 1403 in Venice. In 1495, the Venetian government made efforts to quarantine individuals with leprosy on a hospital island, permitting them to beg under license and restrictions. When a famine ensued from 1527 to 1529, the state banned beggars, hospitalized vagrants, placed lepers in speedily constructed plague stations, and sent those deemed incurable to the hospital of the incurabili. It's evident based on this information that the individuals affected with leprosy and other marginalized groups experienced structural violence in the past, which in turn prevented such individuals from improving their situation in both a social and economic sense. The first seemingly accurate description of the lepromatous form of leprosy referred to the disease as Kushtha in a Sanskrit text dating approximately to 600 BC. Leprosy is mentioned in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedic texts, of which parts may have been composed as early as 1500 BC, along with other skin diseases with curative methods described. I utilized Dr. Gwen Robin Shug's research article Infection, Disease, and Biosocial Processes at the End of the Indo-Civilization to further explore the relationship between leprosy and interpersonal violence in conjunction with structural violence of marginalized groups. The article discusses climatic stress at the end of the 3rd millennium BC in Harappa and its effects on socioeconomic structure and contribution to the collapse of the civilization. I focus particularly on the mortuary differences noted in the research that suggested differential treatment of marginalized groups. Upon comparing the skeletal assemblages, the researchers found that whereas some individuals with pathological lesions consistent with leprosy were granted similar mortuary treatment as those individuals that were unaffected, another group of 23 individuals were given different treatment, and this group had the highest prevalence of infection of all of the assemblages. The same individuals also exhibited a higher risk for interpersonal violence. Due to these mixed findings, the researchers concluded that it is likely that these people were excluded for other reasons or aspects of their character, such as their age, sex, or socioeconomic status. While there does seem to be some relationship between leprosy and interpersonal violence, or at least a co-occurrence, much more research is needed before more definitive conclusions can be drawn.